Henry Charles Bukowski was born into the shell of a typical middle-class German family. For some, he was the perfect example of an underground writer, while others saw him as a misogynistic lowlife, battling with alcoholism his whole life. His writings were raw and unfiltered. He wrote thousands of poems, hundreds of short stories, over 60 novels, and has sold millions of books in more than a dozen languages. This was the kind of commercial success that was practically unheard of in American poetry. Perhaps what sets him apart from other writers was that he represented the average man. People resonated with him. A guy with a blemished face, a beer belly, and greasy hair who spent most of his life working a day job he hated, arguing with his girlfriends, and then writing stories at night. Most nights, he barely slept, only to wake up and do it all over again. Bukowski's goal was to capture the ordinary struggles of poor Americans. He wrote about everything, about alcohol, failed relationships, dead-end jobs, and most importantly, the act of writing itself. His style of writing is anything but pretentious. It is very simple and often darkly funny. He never sugarcoated any topic. He told it exactly as he saw it, without censoring himself in any way. Because of this, he was a very polarizing figure. To some, even a cult hero. Although he would never admit it, Charles Bukowski was fiercely ambitious and a hard-working man. He wasn't always a good person. He treated many people in his life poorly, but he never pretended to be anything he wasn't, nor did he seek anyone's approval. His art was simple, to put on paper what he had seen through his own eyes, his pain and his laughter. Nothing more, nothing less. Charles was born in Andernach, Germany. His father, Henry, was an American of German descent who had served in the US Army after World War I. As far back as Bukowski could trace, his whole family was German. When Bukowski was 3, his family moved to Los Angeles in search of a better life. What they found was struggle and disappointment. His father was often unemployed. Gradually, his frustration turned into violent discipline, which was often carried out with a razor strop. Bukowski grew up learning that pain could arrive for no reason at all. At school, things weren't any better. His thick German accent made him an easy target, and his face, marked by relentless, deep acne, kept him in the shadows. He later said that the pain helped him understand life. Maybe it also helped him understand himself. At 13, he found his first real escape. A friend invited him into a wine cellar and handed him his first glass of alcohol. Suddenly, everything changed. It was magic. Why hadn't someone told me? He later wrote. The alcohol dulled everything, the pain, the loneliness, the fear. It made the world bearable. He decided that this was going to help him for a long time. From that moment on, drinking became a way to survive. It became his greatest ally. For Bukowski, school was just a formality. He graduated from Los Angeles High School and briefly attended City College. He tried journalism and literature, but didn't stay long. He was drawn to life, the raw, unfiltered kind. Not the polished world of academics, but the world of bars, cheap rooms, and factory jobs. He didn't want to write about ideas. He wanted to write about life. The ugly and restless life of the streets. If you were to browse the poetry section of any large bookstore, you would probably find a book or two by each of those critically esteemed, prize-winning poets. However, the poet who takes up the most space will likely be Charles Bukowski. He never won big prizes or received academic praise, yet his books outsold nearly every American poet before or since. In 1941, Bukowski moved to New York City to begin a career as a financially pinched blue-collar worker with hopes of becoming a writer. He had no money or connections, just a pile of short stories and a typewriter. He sent out manuscripts, and each rejection letter was like a kick in the gut. New York didn't want Bukowski, and soon enough, he didn't want New York. He kept moving, drifting from city to city, taking whatever work he could find. He slept in cheap motels, scraping by in run-down rooms, and drinking whenever he could afford it. This was the life he wrote about. He wasn't imagining struggle, he was living it. This lifestyle led him to near starvation, and eventually he wrote home to his family for money. All he received was a letter from his father stating how ashamed he was of him. According to him, this was when he first knew he was destined to be a writer. At 24, Bukowski's first short story, Aftermath of a Lengthy Rejection slip, was published. 2 years later, he published another short story called 20 Tanks from Castle Down, but success didn't follow. Instead, he sank deeper into drinking. Bukowski grew disillusioned with the publication process and quit writing for almost a decade, a time that he referred to as a 10-year drunk. During this time, he moved back to Los Angeles. His days were spent at factory lines and post office desks, his nights at bars. He sank into the kind of self-destruction that would have killed a weaker man. In the end, it was through ruin and relentless honesty that Bukowski became something more than just a writer. In the spring of 1954, Bukowski came dangerously close to death. His body was torn by a bleeding ulcer, forcing him into a hospital bed where, for the first time, he faced his own mortality. When he walked out, something had shifted. He began to write poetry. That same year, he married Barbara Fry, a poet from a small Texas town, but their union was brief. By 1958, they had divorced, and Fry would later die under mysterious circumstances in India. Bukowski was once again alone, and he did what he always did. He drank and he wrote. His early work found its way into the underground poetry scene. Small magazines like Gallows and Nomad had started printing his raw and unfiltered verses. In 1959, Nomad featured 2 of his poems, and a year later they published Manifesto, a call for our own critics, which was one of his defining essays. But Bukowski wasn't just fighting for literary recognition, he was battling the weight of everyday survival. In 1962, Jane Cooney Baker, his first great love, died. He poured his devastation into a flood of poetry and short stories, immortalizing her in his work. Bukowski took his raw, confessional style to Open City, an underground Los Angeles newspaper where he began writing his infamous column, Notes of a Dirty Old Man. When Open City ended, his column was picked up by another famous press which kept his unfiltered voice alive. By this point, Bukowski was no longer just a poet or a columnist. He had become an outlaw voice, a literary cult figure. The same year, his life took a decisive turn. Black Sparrow Press offered him a monthly payment of $100 in exchange for quitting his postal job and writing full-time. Bukowski was 49 when he accepted the offer. In one of his letters he wrote, "I have one of 2 choices, stay in the post office and go crazy, or stay out here and play at writer and starve. I have decided to starve." Less than 1 month after leaving the Postal Service, he completed his first novel, Post Office, a semi-autobiographical take on his years in the mailroom. It would be the first of many books published under Black Sparrow Press, the publisher that believed in him before the world did. Success from his recent works, however, did not tame Bukowski. He continued on a series of love affairs and one-night trysts. His relationships were often brief and volatile. He had a daughter with Francis Smith in 1964. One of these relationships was with Linda King, a sculptor and poet, another with a fiery 23-year-old redhead. He later wrote a book of poetry as a tribute to his love for her, which he titled Scarlet. There were multiple other women who came and went, some even mentioned in his novel, Women. John Martin, the founder of Black Sparrow Press and the man responsible for launching Bukowski's career, once said, "He is not a mainstream author, and he will never have a mainstream public." This was an odd thing to say about a poet who has sold millions of books and has been translated into more than a dozen languages. A commercial success of a kind hardly known in American poetry since the days of Edgar A. Guest. Yet the sense of not being part of the mainstream is integral to Bukowski's appeal. He is one of those writers whom each new reader discovers with a transgressive thrill. By the time the 1970s began, Bukowski had transformed from a struggling poet into a full-time writer, but his essence remained the same. The drunk who wrote, the outsider who refused to play by the rules. His words, crude yet profound, carved out a space for the misfits and the weary, for those who had lived hard and lost often, and for him, this was only the beginning. By 1986, Time magazine called Bukowski the Laureate of American Lowlife, a title he wore like a badge of honor. Adam Kirsch of the New Yorker later reflected on his lasting appeal, saying, "The secret of Bukowski's appeal is that he combines the confessional poet's promise of intimacy with the larger-than-life bravado of a pulp fiction hero. By the end of Bukowski's tormented life, he managed to complete thousands of poems, countless short stories, and 6 novels. Most of these works were accomplished with heavy amounts of alcohol flowing through his bloodstream. That's when he felt most ingenious. Alcohol was the fuel, as it was often the subject of his poetic explosions. During an interview, he said, "I don't think I've written a poem when I was completely sober." Most of his life, he found contentment in the midnight hours, drunk and isolated, where love and hatred tangled under the watchful glow of the moon. His work, one way or another, was always subjected to controversy throughout his career. In 1969, Fox published the first critical study of Bukowski and mentioned his attitude toward women. When women are around, he has to play man. In a way, it's the same kind of pose he plays at in his poetry. Whenever my wife Lucia would come with me to visit him, he'd play the man role, but one night she couldn't come. I got to Book's place and found a whole different guy, easy to get along with, relaxed, accessible. His genius was found in simplicity. He could poetically simplify life in one line of a poem. Bukowski's art was the ability to say a profound thing in a simple way. By the 90s, he traded his typewriter for a computer, but kept his words just as sharp. Bukowski once joked that he didn't even like looking at his typewriter. That writing was just something he did, the same way a spider spins a web. "I don't try, I just type. I'm like a spider spitting my web. It's all I can do." He had spent decades pouring himself into his work. No filter, no hesitation, no pretense. And now, all that remained were the words. Bukowski's last few years on Earth were pretty docile. The man who had spent a lifetime sneering at middle-class comfort now found himself living within it. He had a house, a steady income, and a daily routine. But beneath that veneer, he was still Bukowski. He still drank like a fish. Only difference was that he had traded beer and whiskey for white wine. He still spent his nights writing, and every afternoon he made his way to the racetrack, placing bets and watching the horses run, as if they carried some secret only he could understand. By then, he had nothing left to prove. His books had found an audience. His poems were read by people who once would have dismissed him as just another drunk. Even Hollywood had come knocking. A film based on his younger years had brought his world of dim-lit bars and lost souls to the big screen. Bukowski had always been a man who wrote about what he lived, and now, even as he approached the end, he was still doing just that. He once wrote, "We are here to laugh at the odds and live our lives so well that death will tremble to take us." But in 1994, death finally stopped trembling. Bukowski was diagnosed with leukemia. He kept writing anyway, finishing his last novel, Pulp. On March 9, 1994, Charles Bukowski died in San Pedro at the age of 73. His funeral, arranged by his widow, was an odd sight. Buddhist monks chanting over the grave of a man who spent his life in the company of drunks and outcasts. He was buried at Green Hills Memorial Park, under a headstone that carried 2 words, "Don't try," a phrase that summed up everything he believed about art. He said, "Somebody at one of these places asked me, 'What do you do? How do you write, create?' You don't," I told them. "You don't try. That's very important. Not to try, either for Cadillacs, creation, or immortality. You wait, and if nothing happens, you wait some more. It's like a bug high on the wall. You wait for it to come to you. When it gets close enough, you reach out, slap out, and kill it. Or, if you like its looks, you make a pet out of it."
The further away I am from the human race, the better I feel. Even though I write about the human race. 2 inches is great, 2 miles is great, 2,000 miles is beautiful. As long as I'm able to eat. They feed me because I feed them.